You know, sometimes in history, an event can be both a huge success and a complete disaster at the exact same time. Well, that's exactly what happened at the peak of the Cold War with a secret mission called Operation Storm-333. We're going to break down this incredibly bloody 43-minute raid that, get this, kicked off a war that lasted 9 years.
Okay, so to really get what's going on here, you have to understand this one guy, Hafizullah Amin. He was the communist president of Afghanistan, and by late 1979, wow, he was a man of absolute power, and everyone was terrified of him. He'd basically crushed all his rivals to take control, and his so-called allies in the Soviet Union, they were watching him, and they were getting really nervous.
All right, that brings us right to the heart of it. Picture this. It's December 27th, 1979. You're at the Taj Beg Palace, this massive, opulent place on a snowy hill above Kabul. There's a big party going on. But the host, President Amin himself, is nowhere to be seen. Why? Because he's upstairs, deathly ill. He's just been poisoned. And here's the craziest part. One of the biggest ironies you'll ever hear. The very same Soviet allies who are literally about to storm the palace are, at this exact moment, trying to save his life. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
So let's go inside that chaos for a second. We actually have a good idea of what it was like, thanks to survivors. One of them, Najiba Laima Kasrai, was just a kid, only 11 years old. She remembers this incredible party, golden elevators, sparkling chandeliers, and then, boom, a huge explosion rocks the entire palace. 1 minute it's a party, the next her family is scrambling for their lives as the whole place just erupts into a war zone.
So, what exactly happened to Amin? Well, while all his guests were downstairs partying, he was upstairs just incredibly sick. Turns out a Soviet cook, who was secretly a KGB agent of course, had slipped poison into his lunch. Now, this wasn't their first try, but this time they put the poison into his Coca-Cola. And funny enough, the soda actually diluted the toxin just enough that it didn't kill him right away.
And this is where the story just goes completely off the rails. Amin's guards, who have no idea about the KGB plot, call for help. And who do they call? Soviet military doctors stationed right there in Kabul. So these doctors, just doing their jobs, rush to the palace. They're working like crazy, pumping his stomach, trying to revive him, and they pull it off. They actually save the life of the guy their own government had just tried to assassinate. It's just unbelievable.
So you're probably sitting there thinking, how on earth did things get this weird? An assassination attempt and a rescue mission at the same time by the same country? Well, to get it, we need to hit rewind. This whole mess didn't just pop up overnight. It really started a year earlier, back in 1978. Was something called the Sour Revolution. It put a communist government in charge in Afghanistan, but, and this is the key part, it was a government that was totally deeply divided.
Okay, so the ruling party, the PDPA, was basically split into two rival gangs that hated each other. On one side, you had the Kulk faction. Think of them as the hardliners. They were led by guys like our man Amin, and they wanted to force radical, super fast changes on the country, which was very traditional. Then you had the Parcham faction. They were the moderates, a bit more patient. Now the Soviets, they definitely preferred Parcham. They saw them as way more stable, easier to control. The problem was the unpredictable Kulk faction, and Amin in particular, was the one calling all the shots.
So you can see how this was a powder keg just waiting to explode. This internal fight is what really set the stage for the Kremlin's big decision. They were stuck with this powerful but totally unpredictable ally in Amin, and their trust in him was about to just disappear.
Which brings us to the big question, right? Why would you assassinate your own ally? I mean, Amin was a fellow communist leader. Afghanistan was supposed to be their guy, their client state. So why on earth did the Soviets decide that the only way forward was to literally kill him in a violent coup?
Well, the answer is a pretty toxic cocktail of betrayal, paranoia, and just plain old Cold War fear. First, there was the betrayal. Amin had killed the guy before him, a leader named Taraki, and Soviet Premier Brezhnev had personally promised to keep Taraki safe. So that was a huge slap in the face. Second, Amin's brutal tactics were actually backfiring, sparking this massive rebellion that could have overthrown the whole communist government. And the timing was terrible. This was right after the Islamic Revolution in Iran next door, where a key U.S. ally had been kicked out. The Soviets were absolutely terrified of a domino effect right on their border. They started to think, what if Amin is secretly a CIA agent? What if he's about to flip Afghanistan over to the Americans?
And you can see that paranoia right here in their own words. This is from declassified KGB files. They called him a smooth-talking fascist who was secretly pro-Western. It's pretty wild, right? A lot of historians think this whole Amin is a CIA agent story was actually KGB propaganda that their own bosses started to believe. But honestly, whether it was true or not didn't even matter at that point. They saw him as a loose cannon, a threat they had to get rid of to protect their southern flank. So, the decision was made. Amin had to go. And that takes us right back to the night of December 27th. The poison plot failed. Their own doctors accidentally saved him. So, the Kremlin gave the final order, Plan B, the ground assault. Operation Storm-333 was a go.
Now, the team they put together for this was basically the dream team of Soviet special forces. You had the KGB's absolute best, the legendary Alpha and Zenith groups. Then they had this really clever unit, a GRU Spetsnaz group they called the Muslim Battalion. These were soldiers from Soviet Central Asia who could pass as Afghans, and they were dressed in Afghan army uniforms. To top it all off, they had elite paratroopers for heavy support. Make no mistake, this wasn't an invasion force. This was a decapitation force, designed for one thing and one thing only, to take out the head of state.
And just think about the odds they were facing. The Taubeg Palace wasn't just some house, it was a fortress, defended by over 2,000 elite Afghan presidential guards.
So 2,200 defenders, and the Soviet assault force? Just 660 guys. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1.
And yet, the entire operation, from the first shot fired to the moment the president was dead, took, get this, 43 minutes. Just 43 minutes. It was an absolutely stunning, brutally efficient display of military force.
Meanwhile, inside the palace, as all hell breaks loose, Amin just can't believe what's happening. He actually turns to his aide and says, "The Soviets will help us." His aide has to tell him, "No, it is the Soviets who are attacking us." At first, Amin just says it's a lie, but then he tries to call his chief of staff and can't get through. And that's when it sinks in. He just mutters, "I guessed it. It's all true." He was killed just moments later, hit by shrapnel from a grenade.
So, the raid was over, the palace was taken, the mission was technically a success. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the real story, the consequences of those 43 minutes, was just getting started. The Soviets had won the battle, no doubt. But in doing so, they had just kicked off a war.
And look, from a purely tactical military point of view, Operation Storm-333 was a masterpiece. Seriously, it's the kind of thing they still study in Special Forces training manuals. For its speed, its element of surprise, its sheer lethality. You had a small group of commandos take down a fortress and kill a head of state with very few losses on their side. A textbook success. But that's where the good news ends. That brilliant tactical victory turned into an absolute strategic catastrophe. As one report so perfectly put it, this was 43 minutes that turned into a 9-year war. A war that would leave more than 1 million Afghans dead, cost the Soviets thousands of their own soldiers, and ultimately help bankrupt the entire Soviet empire. You see, the Kremlin thought that by getting rid of Amin, they'd stabilize Afghanistan. But the invasion by a foreign, godless army did the exact opposite. It took all these rival Afghan groups who were fighting each other and united them against a common enemy. The mission gave them a single cause, a holy war, a jihad against the Soviet invaders. What was a civil war instantly became a national war of resistance.
And that leaves us with this incredible paradox, doesn't it? Operation Storm-333 was a perfectly executed plan that led directly to a total disaster. And it leaves us with a huge question, one we're still wrestling with today. What's the real cost of a short, violent victory if it's the spark that ignites a long, devastating, and unwinnable war?